4. Today's speaker is DEP Commissioner Rohit Aggarwala. I am Ross Sandler, Professor of Law and the Director of the Center for New York City Law. Thank you all for attending and for helping to make City Law Breakfast an important public forum. I want to acknowledge first our 3 generous and loyal founding sponsors. They are Consolidated Edison, Verizon, and the law firm of Greenberg Traurig. I also thank all of you for attending the breakfast, and especially those who have made voluntary contributions when you signed up that keep us alive and able to continue these breakfasts. We are enormously grateful for voluntary contributions that you help make the breakfast possible. Those of you who attended before, you know that after the prepared remarks, we'll have a question and comment session. To submit a question or comment, please use the Q&A function on your Zoom screen. You may submit a question or a comment at any time during the breakfast, and we encourage you to do so. We will collect the questions and comments as they come in. I do ask that you identify yourself with your first and last name and your organization. And then following the Q&A, Anthony Crowell will join us for a conversation with the Commissioner. We are delighted to welcome Rohit Aggarwala, Commissioner of the Department of Environmental Protection, to our City Law Breakfast Series. His topic is, what should Earth Day mean for New York City? The Commissioner grew up in White Plains and earned his bachelor's, master's, and PhD degrees from Columbia University. Mayor Bloomberg brought Commissioner Aggarwala into city government in 2006 to head the Office of Long-Term Planning and Sustainability. And in that position, he helped to author the first Plan YC, the city's first sustainability report. Following his time as city government, Commissioner Aggarwala from 2010 to 2015 worked at Bloomberg Philanthropies, heading its sustainability work. He also served as chair of the Regional Plan Association's committee for RPA's 4th regional plan, which was released in 2017. The Commissioner continued his work in the area of climate change and sustainability, and in 2022, Mayor Eric Adams appointed him Commissioner of DEP, and importantly, as Chief Climate Officer for the City of New York. In his positions, he leads the city's efforts at climate resiliency. At a recent talk at the Citizens Budget Commission, Commissioner Aggarwala looked back to 2006 when he first joined the Bloomberg administration. Commissioner Aggarwala compared the climate challenges that the city projected for itself in 2006 with the projections of climate challenges the city now projects in 2023. He said, and I paraphrase, the impacts of climate change are projected today to be worse than we projected in 2006. And the climate impacts we anticipated in 2006 are coming sooner than we anticipated. Projected impacts are worse and coming sooner. Commissioner Aggarwala, in the same talk, agreed that it was easy to elaborate a vision for dealing with climate change, but far more difficult to make choices and to develop plans to pay for those choices. I can think of no one better suited or more educated on climate and sustainability to lead the city in making those choices than Commissioner Aggarwala. We are proud to welcome the Commissioner to New York Law School. Commissioner, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ross. It is a pleasure and an honor to be here at New York Law School. I think the 165th in this series that I have often looked at and marveled at the wonderful speakers you have. So it's a privilege to be here. And it is particularly appropriate, and I'm grateful to be able to be here during Earth Week. This Saturday is, of course, Earth Day, and it's a day and a week when we often focus on the question, like the title of today's talk, what should Earth Day mean for New York City? And as Ross indicated, I think it means a great deal, and it has to, because dealing with the environment, dealing with the challenge of climate change is fundamentally critical to the future of our city. I'll start with a few comments on, in fact, what is at stake here. Around the world, what we have seen over the last 10 or 15 years is, and Ross cited what I said at CBC, climate change moving from something that was projected and theoretical to something that we are no longer thinking about, we are experiencing on a regular basis. Basically, at any given time right now, there are significant weather issues going on around the world that are related to climate change. I was reading yesterday just about how severe the drought, for example, in Spain is. They are in the third year of a drought there, where already at this point in the year, which should be the wettest point, the soil is absolutely dry because they have had no rain. And that's just one example. We've seen massive flooding, of course, in Pakistan this year. We've seen crop issues in Africa. And we've seen, of course, the atmospheric rivers in California. And we'll see what this year holds for us. But of course, we've just experienced just about the warmest winter that anybody can remember. And while weather fluctuates, we know that the bigger variations, the more extreme storms, the more fluctuating temperatures that we've seen are consistent with everything we've expected from climate change, and it is coming sooner. We are, of course, a coastal city. New York City has more than 500 miles of coastline, which means we are extraordinarily vulnerable to the combined impacts of extreme weather and sea level rise. And that puts, in fact, a huge percentage of New Yorkers at risk for flooding, both under today's conditions and even more so under the sea level rise that we're expecting over the next 50 years, say. And of course, one of the things that we've seen time and time again is that every couple of years we get new climate projections, and every couple of years those are at the high end of the previous numbers for climate change. Right. So our models tend to be more conservative and moderate than the reality has turned out to be, which means we should be increasingly taking seriously the more extreme projections for what climate change could offer. And there are, of course, some real doomsday scenarios involving ice melt in Greenland and in Antarctica that could spell real disaster for coastal cities around the world. And New York is no example. New York is no exception. The reality, though, is that while flooding gets lots of attention because flooding happens immediately, it's very vivid. And when, unfortunately, it kills people, as it did in Hurricane Sandy 11 years ago and in Hurricane Ida 2 years ago, we know who they are. We know exactly what caused their deaths. The reality is that over time, in fact, the greatest killer in most cities related to climate change, and New York, again, is no exception, is heat. That we estimate that while about 53 people between Hurricane Sandy and Hurricane Ida died as a result of climate change-related flooding in New York City, we believe more than 350 people over the last decade have died due to heat related to climate change. That's, of course, a statistical analysis. We look at when heat waves occur, how much more extreme they are, how many excess deaths take place during heat waves, and we attribute that to climate change. So it's hard to say, well, oh, yesterday so-and-so died because of heat related to climate change. But on aggregate, that is a much greater public health issue. It's also the area in which there is greater inequity. Flooding has, particularly in Hurricane Ida, when people who lived in basement apartments were so hard hit, flooding certainly has a component of inequity. But the reality is that basically nobody dies of heat in New York City unless they are elderly and poor, and almost always people of color, because those are the people who die at home in apartments that are either unair conditioned or where, because of poverty and the fear of the energy bill, they are choosing not to turn on the air conditioner, even when their personal health is at stake. And so climate change is very real. Climate change is something that New York City has to address. We've got to address it both on the side of mitigation, where we reduce our carbon footprint and join the global effort to halt climate change, because, of course, when you find yourself in a hole, the first thing you do is stop digging. We've got to stop making this problem worse, and we've got to make sure that we invest to make the city more resilient. We start out in a good place, and we have to keep reminding ourselves that New York City is so much better positioned both to reach a low carbon future and to be resilient than many other cities around the world, even cities of a similar level of wealth and development. We have, of course, our density going for us. There is no question that living in close confines is helpful. It reduces the amount we consume. It reduces the amount of heating we need to do, because apartment buildings insulated each other. Even if you drive in an urban area, chances are you drive less than you do if you drive in a suburban area, just because your grocery store might be 3 miles away and you're going to drive there, but it's not going to be 6 miles away. We know, of course, that New York City's density is what maintains our transit system. And while that's been a huge challenge over the last couple of years with the pandemic, still the fundamental economics of transit in New York City are so much more promising than they are in basically any other city in North America. We have a great water supply system. One of the biggest challenges that climate change is posing to communities around the world, and of course it's most vivid in the Western United States right now, is the supply of water. In some cases, that's simply due to the weather. In some cases, it's due to a lack of investment and smart management. But I have to say, and of course, I've only been leading the Department of Environmental Protection for a year or so I'm not going to claim any credit for it, because New York City has a nearly 200-year history of really smart, thoughtful investments, excuse me, in its water system, which is one of the reasons that you look around the country, around the world, there are few cities that have it as easy in terms of water as we do. We have an ample supply. It is tremendously clean and safe. It is highly reliable. We have maintained it. We have a great financing system that allows us this year, for example, to invest $2 billion in our water system with bonds that have very high ratings and a great deal of stability in how we manage that system. And in the Northeast, we are one of the few places in the world that climate change is projected to bring us more water over time rather than less. And so we may have to prepare for some occasional droughts of a year or two because of that change in variability in the climate. But the likelihood is not that we will have the kind of long-term severe droughts that the Western US, that Europe, and that parts of Asia and Africa are experiencing. There are also some other infrastructure systems that I don't think we fully appreciate. One, for example, is the Con Ed steam system. And while it's got challenges because, of course, right now it's powered by natural gas, it's a really efficient way to get energy to buildings that complements electricity. And it's a kind of infrastructure, again, that you can only really have in a high density environment. So New York City starts out with a lot of strengths. But we've got a lot of work we've got to do. For the last 15 years, we've been focused on the three areas that we've known to be the top sources of carbon emissions in New York City, the most important being buildings, the second most important being transportation, the third most important being waste. And of course, there's a lot of ongoing work that this administration has inherited and has committed to delivering on. That started in the Bloomberg and the de Blasio administrations around decarbonizing buildings, most notably through Local Law 97, which I'm happy to talk about further. Continuing our shift away from the private automobile in our transit system, our transportation system, and also switching our automobiles and our trucking's system to electrification, to reducing the impact of our waste system on the environment. That comes from our biggest thing that we're doing right now is shifting to universal curbside organics collection, which will take the most damaging component of the waste stream out of landfill, prevent all of it from decomposing into methane and being released into the environment, and instead we'll be able to beneficially to use that massive amount of organic material as compost, as biogas, and as land treatment. In ways that also have the benefit of reducing trucking and creating jobs inside New York City. And then finally, over the last 10 years since Hurricane Sandy, we've done so much on resilience, and that is going to be the work of generations. We've over the last year or so, every now and then I have people ask, what's our plan to achieve resilience? And unfortunately, the reality is that that's a bit like asking, what's our plan to achieve education? As if there's some point at which we're going to be done with education. We're never going to be done with education. We're never going to be done with investing in our transportation system. And we're never going to be done with investing in resilience because until the climate stabilizes, which realistically none of us is going to live long enough to see, we are constantly going to be investing in and planning for the changes we need to make to prepare the city for a changing climate. That's going to take a number of fronts. There's an ongoing effort that some of you are probably aware of called the Harbor and Tributaries Study, HATS for short, which is being managed by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. That's a massive 30-year project, currently estimated to cost around $50 billion. But of course, as these things go, chances are it will cost a lot more than that by the time it is done, to build coastal defenses for New York City and its surrounding area to protect us from coastal inundation. New York City is deeply involved in that work, but the Army Corps is leading it. And that will be something that I believe will change the face of New York City, because it will drastically affect how our waterfront looks, how we interact with our harbor, and the choices that we make in when and how that is built are going to be critical for the future of the city. But of course, as Hurricane Ida showed, coastal flooding is not the only threat that we face. We also face the risk of further extreme rainfall. Hurricane Ida, one of the reasons that it in September of 2021 was so devastating and cost the lives of 11 New Yorkers, is that it was so out of line with any of the history of rainfall that New York City had received. Until August of 2021, New York City had never recorded a rainfall that was more intense than 1.75 inches per hour. And of course, it's worth noting, the amount of rain that falls over a day or over a week is not necessarily going to cause flooding, but the amount of rain that falls in a short period of time is what really causes flooding. The ground can't absorb it, the sewers can't absorb it, the treatment plants can't absorb it. So we think about that intense hour as the real indicator of the flooding potential of a storm. And so throughout history, we'd never experienced a storm of 1.75 inches. And that's what our sewer system is designed for, to absorb a storm of 1.75 inches. It's not in every place, unfortunately, particularly in parts of Queens and the Bronx. Past borough presidents allowed for substandard sewers to be built, but that is our current standard of 1.75 inches. In late August, on the 22nd of August in 2021, Hurricane Henri arrived, and it gave a record-breaking storm that delivered 1.91 inches of rain in 1 hour. And then only 10 days later, on the 1st of September, Hurricane Ida delivered 3.75 inches per hour. And we need to pause and think about that. A record of 1.75 broken with 1.91 and then doubled with 3.75 inches in 1 hour. And that's an example of what's to come. I mean, it's not a surprise then, if you double the amount of rain that these sewers are designed for, you're going to get massive flooding. Happily, that rain was not across the entire city. There were only a couple of neighborhoods that experienced the full intensity of the storm. And then what we saw last summer in 2022 was a series of massive cloudbursts that happened in very short periods of time over very small parts of the city. And that, I think, is a harbinger of a shift to a more tropical weather pattern. We're accustomed, if we visit Florida or the Caribbean or parts of the tropics, to see rainfall that happens. It comes out of nowhere. It happens in very short bursts. It's very intense. And often it happens in a very small area. So one part of just down the street, you could have a lot of rain, and maybe a mile away, you don't have much rain at all. We had one storm last summer where there was a peak intensity of only 0.15 inches in Central Park. And the same morning, LaGuardia Airport got more than 2 inches of rain. And so that's an indication of the way that all of our weather patterns are changing over time. And it's going to require us to think very differently about how we manage stormwater. We've traditionally, again, relied on that sewer system. We are now developing at DEP a set of alternatives for how we complement the sewer system with surface retention, which we call cloudburst infrastructure, where you design things like playgrounds to absorb water and retain water during extreme events. Some of you may be aware of the blue belts that we have primarily on Staten Island, which are effectively lakes that we connect to storm sewers, and they become part of the stormwater infrastructure. They're extraordinarily flexible because, of course, that's how nature deals with rainfall, is lakes get bigger, and when in dry periods, lakes get smaller, and that's kind of your excess capacity. We are now looking around the city at whether there are locations, including potentially locations where there are currently buildings, where flooding is frequent and where instead perhaps we should go ahead and build a blue belt to absorb water from the neighborhood and protect the surrounding properties. And then finally, we are going to have to think about whether there are parts of the city where we have to think about moving away from. This is something that, of course, is really sensitive. We've got people around the city who are dedicated to their homes, but increasingly we've had people who are coming to us and saying, hey, I've gotten flooded now 2 or 3 times. I see the writing on the wall. Maybe we should think differently. Instead of trying to protect this location, maybe it should become a different land use. And that is something that we're going to have to take seriously in New York City. Another component, and something that is brand new, and in fact, we just announced yesterday, and I'll ask my colleague Ryan to go ahead and put up a slide or two. One of the things that I think is fantastic about the work that we've done in New York City on climate change since 2007, since the Bloomberg administration, is it's always been data-driven. Plan YC, which was Mayor Bloomberg's first sustainability plan in 2007, started with a greenhouse gas inventory. And it was that data, which we update once every year in New York City, which is still pretty rare among global cities to do an annual update, that led to that hierarchy of knowing that it was buildings that were our largest source of emissions and transportation and waste. Just this year, and something that Mayor Adams announced yesterday, is we've augmented our traditional inventory with a consumption-based inventory. And Ryan, give us our next slide, please. The standard by which cities calculate their greenhouse gas inventories is a geographic base. This is what all cities do. It's something that the C40 Cities Climate Leadership Group and the World Resources Institute, there are standards. It's called the Global Protocol for community scale emissions. And that's what we do. That only calculates fossil fuels that are combusted within the 5 boroughs. So gasoline consumed in cars on the roads in the 5 boroughs, natural gas combusted in boilers inside buildings in the 5 boroughs, plus any fossil fuels used to create electricity that is shipped into the 5 boroughs. It does not, however, take into account if somebody is driving a truckload of lettuce from California to New York City, only that last couple of miles of that truck's emissions from the George Washington Bridge to the Hunts Point Terminal Market are going to be incorporated in our existing geography-based inventory. And it says nothing about the emissions related to growing that lettuce or producing the clothes that we wear or the computers that we're all talking on right now. And so for the first time ever, we've undertaken a consumption-based inventory as well. This tries to estimate the carbon footprint of all the food we eat, the clothes we buy, the consumer goods that we have, the services that we obtain. It was done with the C40 cities. We've done it in conjunction with the City of London, which is about to come out with their own numbers as well, and with a consulting firm called Eco Data Lab. And it led to us to think somewhat differently about our emissions inventory. And the next slide, please, Ryan. What we see when we combine these is that there's a significant overlap, but there's an awful lot, nearly double of our, nearly an amount equal to what we've had in our geographic carbon inventory is now what we are taking into account as part of our consumption-based inventory. And what you see on the right-hand side, when we put these two together, and we are taking into account the overlap, so we're not double counting, is that buildings are still our largest source of emissions. Transportation is our second largest source of emissions, but a close third is the food we eat. And that's dominated by the fact that meat and dairy have massive carbon footprints. And as Mayor Adams said, we're going to have to start taking seriously the responsibility to change the way we eat if we are going to make a real impact on the world's carbon footprint. And I'll conclude just by, and Ryan, I'll just take actually, you can take the slides down, with the fact that a law that I'm very pleased that we enacted during the Bloomberg administration requires that New York City update its long-term sustainability plan every 4 years. I think that's been really good discipline. It's ensured that each mayor takes ownership of a climate strategy. Mayor Bloomberg came out with the first Plan NYC in 2007, and then an update in 2011. Mayor de Blasio continued that with what he called 1 NYC in 2015, and again 1 NYC 2050, which came out in 2019, and that has shaped a lot of the work that's gone on, including Local Law 97. And later this week, Mayor Adams will deliver his version of that sustainability plan. As I look back on the 4 plans already, they've reflected the period in which they were operating. The first Plan YC was basically the clarion call that said, hey, climate change is real. We've got to think about the environment. It was also very much focused on the fact that New York City was growing again, that after 20 years of decline and stabilization in the 2000s, of course, New York's population started really growing. And we had to start thinking about how we have both growth and a better environment at the same time. And that was really the promise of sustainability, is that we could be more like New York City, we could increase our quality of life, and we could do a better job of taking care of the planet. 2011 continued that. Mayor de Blasio expanded the scope of Plan YC to include things like education and social services, basically made it the strategic plan for the city, and therefore called it 1 NYC. And he really emphasized equity to his credit, and brought about a focus where we think about environmental justice and equity as co-equal in terms of importance to climate action. Mayor de Blasio, of course, was also operating in, shall we say, a generous economic situation. Those 8 years were a period of rising city budgets, rising tax revenue, and a booming economy. Of course, that's not what we are facing today. And so I think the Adams administration sustainability plan is going to reflect the fact that we have to go back to the way we did sustainability planning to a certain extent in 2007 and 2011, be creative, focus on implementation and delivering, because the reality is the time has passed for climate action to be about big new commitments. Climate action is now about day-to-day decisions. It's about how we deliver everything. It's one of the reasons that Mayor Adams asked me to do both of these jobs, both to have a citywide climate role as Chief Climate Officer, but also to lead a operating agency like DEP that has not only long-term capital plans that we deliver, but of course daily operations to ensure that New Yorkers get water. That imposes a discipline that is going to require us to think about how we work with the private sector, how we make it easy to achieve climate action, without reducing our ambition for the goals that we have to achieve. We are also going to be focused very much on taking full advantage of the state and federal opportunities that are out there, because of course one of the advantages we do have is, thanks to the bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act and the Environmental Bond Act at the state level, there should, over the next several years, be literally billions of dollars that we can get from the state and federal governments to support environmental action in New York City. I will close there and look forward to your questions. But if I go back to this opening question of what does Earth Day mean for New York City, I think it means we need to be proud to be New Yorkers. We need to reaffirm the fact that the way we live is the way people have to live to keep our planet healthy while having a high standard of living. But the reality is that things are going to have to change. We are going to have to do a lot of work on our buildings. We are going to have to continue to change the way we move about the city. We're going to have to think differently about how we eat. And we are going to have to be willing to see our city change visibly to become more resilient, to protect ourselves from the climate that we face. Thank you for the opportunity. It's been a great pleasure.
Thank you for a really terrific rundown of the challenges and opportunities. Let me ask you just a follow-up question first on your description as Chief Climate Officer. How does that work? There's so many other agencies are involved. Could you tell us a little bit more about the formal and informal ways that you work as Chief Climate Officer?
Well, in a formal way, one of the things Mayor Adams did is we've rebranded what started out as the Office of Long-Term Planning and Sustainability, became the Mayor's Office of Sustainability and the Mayor's Office of Resilience. We've created all of those now into the Mayor's Office of Climate and Environmental Justice, led by Executive Director Kizzy Charles Guzman. Her office reports to me, so that's the kind of official role I have as Chief Climate Officer. But what I've also played a significant role in is working with the many city agencies that have their own climate action to make sure that, number one, they are getting the support that they need, and that we have a consistent approach across the administration to climate action that is led in multiple places. And I'll say, Ross, one of the things I've seen that's very different about my role now than it was when I was running OLTPS during the Bloomberg administration is then basically all of the climate stuff came out of that climate office. Now it's like being a conductor of an orchestra, right? I mean, we have 15 or more agencies that have sustainability leads, whether it's a deputy commissioner or a different title. Once every other week, we convene all of the climate leads across city government for a coordinating phone call. So everybody knows what each other is doing. We can support each other. We can debottleneck. We create consistency. Just two examples there. Of course, the Department of Buildings is in the lead on implementing Local Law 97, but it's complemented by the work of the New York City Accelerator and several other programs that are run out of MOCEJ, as well as work being done out of HPD and under the work of the Chief Housing Officer. We've got to make sure all of that has a consistent approach and that it's working together. Similarly, you look at what the Department of City Planning is doing on zero emission zoning, and it's amazing. It's got to be coordinated just to make sure that we've got a consistent approach.
Well, I think that's really important. I think back to Robert Moses as the transportation and housing coordinator. There was real power, and maybe if things get worse, we need a similar authority. So let's go to the first question. Tom McMahon brings you back to Local 97 and raises one of the issues about closing down natural gas cogen production and the possibility that when you do, you get something worse. What do you have thoughts about that? You're not getting it?
Sorry, Ross, could you just repeat that?
Okay, he's talking about Local Law 97, and he talks about the possibility of closing down natural gas cogen production for electricity and then substituting dirtier energy from the grid. And I guess he's raising one of the many challenges in this regard. So maybe speaking about Local 97 would be helpful, including the cogen problem.
Sure, and look, I think that example of cogen it highlights the extent to which Local Law 97 is a critical law that's got to get implemented, but we've got to do it in a thoughtful way. And that doesn't mean giving everybody a free pass, but it does mean recognizing that there's nuance to the way our buildings work and our energy system works. I think to this cogen example, we are aware of a handful of cogen facilities around the city where on their own, the natural gas that they are burning is on average cleaner than the grid is now. It is not cleaner than the grid will be probably by 2030, right? And so thinking about the right staging at which we might encourage a building or require a building to switch from that cogen to electrification, I think that requires some nuance. I think that's reflected in the coefficients that the Department of Buildings enacted into regulation late last year. But we are certainly going to be making use, and there will be upcoming regulation coming out from DOB, where what we are really going to be looking towards is to ensure that every building has a thoughtful plan for how they achieve their 2030 targets. I think one of the things that has gotten lost on the discussion of Local Law 97 over the last several years is it's been focused on as a set of fines. And really, it's the conversation has been about, well, are you going to hit buildings over the head if they don't reach their mark? That is one way to think about it. On the other hand, the name of that law was the Climate Mobilization Act. And so what we are really focused on in the Adams administration is figuring out how do we use the implementation of that law, how do we use the various components of that law. That law does, I mean, the law encourages, I know some advocates don't like this, but the law actually encourages the use of RECs. The law does create very clearly this good faith effort clause that allows building owners to avoid fines if they are pursuing decarbonization with good faith. And we are going to use those as a way to guide building owners to achieve their goals and to mobilize. We're going to be fully ambitious about that mobilization, but we are going to recognize that there's nuance like some of these cogen plants.
Thanks. Thank you. Now, Kevin Duggan from Streets blog. This relates again to the coordination problem. What about the mayor, the issue about 3 lanes or 2 lanes on the BQE? Mayor de Blasio's panel recommended reduced to 2 lanes. Do you think possibly widening the highway to 3 lanes and allowing more vehicle traffic would be good climate policy?
Well, look, I think the most important thing about the BQE, and this was consistent with the panel, Ross, that you and I served on, is that what has to happen with the BQE is a corridor-wide approach. I think the biggest single mistake is looking at that 1 mile stretch as if it were disconnected from what's north of it and south of it. Fundamentally, whether it's 2 lanes or 3 lanes, there is not going to be a successful solution that moves the needle in terms of climate or any other component of either economic or environmental quality of life, unless we think about it as a corridor. We need the state government to be willing to be an aggressive partner on that, and we need creativity from the federal government as well.
Here's from Kendall Christensen, DEP 14 water resource recovery. DEP's 14 water resource recovery facilities offer a unique set of assets for addressing greenhouse gases, and that you've issued the first of 3 RFEIs. That's requests for expressions of interest. And could you talk about that? Can you describe the vision behind those?
Sure, I'm excited about that. Thanks, Kendall. Glad you're paying attention. As the question notes, DEP has anaerobic digesters at all 14 of our wastewater treatment plants because, in fact, basically the only thing you can do with sewage is decompose it through anaerobic digestion. What that does is it throws off methane and it throws off biosolids. Right now, DEP has been working over the last several years. We're about halfway there to reuse as many of the biosolids in a beneficial way as possible. We currently reuse the majority of those. We use them as a soil substitute by and large. I'd like to get it all the way over time to a full Class A kind of compost product. We know that a number of other utilities, most notably DC Water in Washington, actually the solids that come out of their treatment plant, you could stick your hand into because it's topsoil. You could put it in the flower pot in your apartment. Over time, I'd like to get to that. And that's one of the RFEIs that we're issuing is to see if there are partners who are interested in working with DEP on the solid side to get to that level. The other thing is capturing the gas. At a couple of our treatment plants, we capture the gas that's emitted from that process to generate heat and electricity for use inside the plant. As the grid gets cleaner, much like the earlier question about cogeneration, as the grid gets cleaner, it actually makes more sense to use electricity in our treatment plants and use that biogas for hard to electrify functions. We know there are industrial processes around the city and other places that are going to find it very hard to move away from natural gas. And so we've issued this RFEI to see if there are partners or off-takers who would like to purchase that biogas, clean it up, put it into the grid, but buy it in a dedicated way. I'm not excited about just injecting it generally into the grid because we shouldn't be just prolonging the life of the natural gas infrastructure, but in targeted applications that we know are going to be very difficult to electrify. I think there's a real advantage and opportunity. And of course, the most important thing is we shouldn't be flaring this, and above all else, we shouldn't be leaking it. And DEP is actually working on a comprehensive effort to make sure that we seal all of the leaks at our various treatment plants. Because with 14 plants, as you might imagine, we've got a bunch of leaks, and we recognize the impact of those fugitive emissions.
Here's a series of questions which emphasizes the breadth of being the chief climate officer of the city. Irene asks about how do you do a better job of recycling. Daniel Abrams asks about what about the lack of trees and canopy cover in many areas where we have increased heat. Claire Mifflin asks about what about waste reduction initiatives. This just emphasizes the breadth and the number of agencies involved. Comments on those questions?
Well, look, they're all things we are working on. And as I said, Ross, earlier, the good news is this is not the work of one person or even one office. This is really a whole of government approach. On recycling, of course, waste reduction is important. We have been strongly supporting the extended producer responsibility bills in Albany. We are big supporters of what the governor has proposed, and while I understand it's not expected to be done in the budget, we are still enthusiastic about the governor's proposal for EPR there. That would have a significant impact on the total volume of waste. But the most important thing that we have to do in terms of our waste stream is that separation of organics. It's the worst part of the waste stream. It's the wettest, the heaviest, the part that produces the most methane. And so above all else, getting to organics collection, as we will by the end of 2024, is the top priority. Sorry, there was recycling. I've forgotten.
And trees and cover and trees, the lapses.
And I mean, tree canopy is another one. And as I said, that tree canopy has got to be a core strategy for heat, as we think about addressing the climate change impact of extreme heat. The good news is New York City does pretty well in many parts of the city in terms of tree canopy coverage. We're at about a 27%, I think, canopy coverage. We want to get to 30%. And the questioner is correct. Of course, there are some parts of the city that, for historic reasons, in some cases because of the underground infrastructure, they have less shade. I think we have a number of targeted initiatives that we're going to be working on, and one that we announced last year that we'll be saying more about later this week, when the new sustainability plan comes out, is called Climate Strong Communities. And one of the things that recognizes, it's a neighborhood-based program where we're going to be going into a series of environmental justice neighborhoods to do local integrated planning to ensure that we can address canopy and urban heat island issues, stormwater resilience, coastal resilience, and social resilience, all through the same efforts. Because what we find is those are interrelated. If you're going to build a blue belt or stormwater containment areas, a lot of those strategies necessarily involve trees. And trees, by the way, are one of the best ways you capture stormwater, because it's amazing how much water will actually adhere to the leaves and take a long time to either flow down or evaporate.
Here's a question from Mark Diller, and he's sort of asking, what are you going to do tomorrow morning? He says, what are the biggest areas where we can make progress now?
Well, look, I think from a citywide perspective, what I'm going to be doing tomorrow morning, I actually haven't looked at my calendar, so don't hold me to this specifically. But, again, I think it is around, actually, what I spend most of my time doing is thinking about ensuring that the institutions are operating in the right way. And that's one of the things that we're going to have a lot to say on later this week in the sustainability plan. We do not yet have the right institutions really to manage an overarching approach to resilience. We've got to address that. We are still building the institution within the Department of Buildings and across city government to really implement Local Law 97. We've got institutional work to do there. It's a little like, again, 15 years ago, we had to build the New York Panel on Climate Change. So we had a body of experts to give us projections. We had to build the institution of a greenhouse gas inventory so we could have a sense of where we were headed and what we were doing. So in my role, I focus on building that institution. I think from city government, again, we're going to be focused on the key areas of buildings, transportation, waste, and food, and then resilience. From an individual perspective, I and every other New Yorker, if you own your home or your apartment, switch to that induction stovetop. I did mine last year. It's fantastic. It's much better than the gas stovetop I replaced it with. I say that as somebody who loves to cook. If you own a car, drive less and eventually get an EV. And no matter what you do, just eat a little bit less meat. You don't have to become a vegetarian or a vegan, but just eat a little bit less meat over the course of the week, and you'll have a big carbon impact.
Okay. There's from Janelle and another area. What about NYCHA? What kind of initiatives do you work with NYCHA and other public housing?
So I will say NYCHA is, I think, an unsung hero of New York City's sustainability and resilience efforts. Over the last 10 years since Hurricane Sandy, the city has invested more than $500 million to make NYCHA housing more resilient. It's not as visible as building a seawall or the project at Esker or in the Rockaways. But what they have been going through and doing is hardening the buildings so that if there is flooding, because as we know, many NYCHA buildings are in the flood zone, that they might have a disruption for a day or 2 days, but they're not going to have the kind of sustained damage that many of those buildings experienced during Hurricane Sandy, when equipment was destroyed and it took months to get full functionality back. So that's really what resilience means, is being able to bounce back. Like I liken it to a snowstorm. We don't assume the city functions as normal in the middle of a 12-inch blizzard, but we have a resilient system so that within 12 or 24 hours after that blizzard, we can be back to normal. NYCHA has done really good work in ensuring that its buildings can get back to normal. There's also a lot of work going on at NYCHA under the leadership of my colleague Vlada Kennikov, who's a fantastic sustainability lead there, to move NYCHA to window-based heat pumps. They've leveraged NYCHA's massive scale. They got a great grant from NYSERDA and put out a challenge to industry to create window units that are all electric and provide both heating and cooling. And NYCHA will be able to buy these in the thousands as it works to electrify its buildings. That'll provide, again, not only more reliable heat, but actually air conditioning for its residents as well. So NYCHA is actually quite a bright spot on sustainability.
Here's a couple related questions. Emily Swarza, a New York Law School student, talks about, and Linda, another person, talks about wetlands, and in particular Staten Island, and concerned about businesses that are building in wetland areas. Can you discuss the importance of our wetlands and what we can do to protect the wetlands within the city limits?
Well, wetlands are, of course, critically important, both for stormwater protection and for coastal inundation protection, as well, of course, as the biodiversity and broader ecological benefits that wetlands bring us. I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but actually a very high percentage of the wetlands in New York City are already protected. They're either under the Parks Administrator or the Parks Department, or they're protected in some other way. We have large amounts of wetlands that are in Gateway National Park, of course, and then some wetlands are incorporated into DEP's Blue Belt areas. So they are vitally important. I think as we continue with our resilience planning, I think you're going to see an even greater emphasis on what we do with wetlands over time.
I'm sorry to say it'll have to be the last question. This is from Lou Vinich. Hi, Lou. Nice to see you, Lou. Thinking of the new focus on food consumption, and what do you see as DEP's partnership with agricultural interests in the watershed areas to increase share of regionally produced food consumed in New York City?
Thanks, Lou. So as part of the filtration avoidance determination, which is, as many of you know, has been in place for nearly 20 years and allows us to work with the people who live in the watershed to protect our water supply so that we don't have to filter it. New York City has, for that period of time, had a great partnership with the Watershed Agricultural Council, which is a coalition of the farming interests in the watershed. That's already paid off in dividends in terms of projects that we do with farmers in the watershed to capture runoff from their farms, to keep runoff from entering the watershed, and things like that. One of the things that I see going on in the watershed is the beginnings of an economic shift away from beef and dairy farming to organic truck farming. That's not something we're imposing. That's something that I think some of the economics up there are delivering. And so we are going to be eagerly looking to work over the next year or two with the Watershed Agricultural Council and others up there to see what kind of role DEP can play, probably in partnership with Grow NYC, which manages the city's green markets, to see if there are ways that we can incentivize that greater shift, help the farmers who are doing organic fruit and vegetable farming, and help them bring that local produce to the city. I don't have a lot of details yet, but it's certainly something that we're going to want to work on.
Oh, thank you. I'm sorry this is the last question. I would like to just acknowledge people who asked questions and we didn't get to. Carrie Harris, Alia Sumara, Adrian G, Richard Nicholson, Alice Blank, and Eric Goldstein, Claire Miffin. Thank you for asking questions. I'm sorry we don't have more time. I will send the questions on to you, and perhaps you'll have a chance to think about them or answer them. Now I'm going to turn the microphone over to our Dean, Dean Anthony Crowell, for a short conversation with the Commissioner. Dean Crowell. Where is Dean Crowell? Here he is.
I'm right here.
Okay.
Thanks so much for a great talk, Commissioner. I appreciate it very much. You and I have known each other for a very long time, having, I guess, grown up in government a bit during the Bloomberg administration, and it's a real treat and great privilege to see all the great work you're doing. Recently, I was appointed to the City Planning Commission, and I've been doing a lot of thinking in the work that the commission is doing about climate change, about resiliency. And I've also been thinking about the role of lawyers in that process. Can you share with us a little bit of your thinking as to the role of lawyers in the overall process of developing a better plan for resiliency and sustainability overall in the city?
Wow. It's a thoughtful question, Dean. If you call me Commissioner, I'm going to have to call you Dean.
Okay.
Um,
I'll call you Rick, you call me Anthony.
All right, thank you. Look, obviously, I think at a high level, lawyers play a crucial role in so many aspects of environmental policy, right? And so much of the progress that both as a city and as a nation that we've achieved is due to environmental regulation, right? There's no way around it. And sometimes, of course, my agency at DEP, we're pushing against being regulated and things where we're on the wrong side of that regulation sometimes. But the reality is the harbor is better because of the Clean Water Act. The sky is clearer because of the Clean Air Act. Overall, we're better off because of NEPA. I think one of the challenges that we do face, though, is the need to figure out how we can do things quickly. I shudder a little bit at Ross earlier hinting that maybe I had something in common with Robert Moses, other than working in New York City government. Nobody wants to have anything in common with him.
I didn't necessarily agree with that idea.
but I see his point. And I think the times that I get most concerned actually are when I worry about how long it's going to take for us to do the things that we need to do. Unfortunately, haste is something you see in authoritarian governments, right? China can build a high-speed rail system in a couple of years around the whole country because they don't have to do a lot of hearings or a lot of due process or worry a lot about things. And of course, we would never want to sacrifice the benefits of democracy for that. But I think we are going to have to think very carefully about whether we have burdened government so much that it is unable to act as fast as we need to deal with climate change. I will give you one example. There are a lot of people out there who have been encouraging New York City to develop a buyout program, to buy out land from people who own buildings where they are flooding on a regular basis. One of the barriers to doing that is ULURP. That whenever New York City buys a piece of land, it has to go through ULURP. That's an 11-month process, as we all know. The whole point of a buyout program, we know that you need to have a standing offer so that the day a storm hits, the person can say yes the next morning, right? If they wait even a month, they've started the cleanup process and they're unwilling to sell. And so ULURP is actually one of our problems. We've got a similar place around the city. I won't talk about the specifics, but where I recently looked at the plan, there's one approach for green infrastructure to deal with a flooding solution. It'll cost half as much as the gray infrastructure approach. But because the green infrastructure approach involves buying a piece of land, it'll take a lot longer. And those people are eager not to have to wait, right? And so how lawyers can help us figure out how to achieve all of the process, all of the protections, all of the consultation that democracy requires, but do so quickly, I think becomes one of the key imperatives right now.
Yeah, I think that's an astute point, and along the lines of what I've been thinking too about, just there's a need for process, a need for public engagement, but there is a real there's a social and environmental imperative to take steps that allow us to make progress and to guard against the ills we ultimately seek through responsible regulation. That leads me to another broader question that I had, is in thinking about our role at New York Law School and how such a large focus of ours is state and local government law, what should a curriculum look like? I don't think it's the standard environmental law curriculum anymore. I think it's far more interdisciplinary. But what, from your standpoint, and as somebody who's no stranger to sophisticated academic institutions, what would you hope that new generation of lawyers has studied and has focused on?
Another really good question. I'd say two things that I'd hope that that next generation are thinking about. One is actually looking at our body of, say, the last 50 years, and of course it goes well beyond that, but most relevantly, starting with NEPA 50 years ago, looking beyond that body of environmental law and looking comparatively at how other countries do it, because that may be where we find other mechanisms. I mean, you think about kind of the Dutch water boards and how they work. Certainly, I'd argue the EU has figured a number of things out in terms of environmental management that they're doing better than we are. I don't think Americans understand and make use of, say, what Japan can do. Another country that has great traditions and has done a lot in terms of infrastructure and the environment that we probably take some inspiration from. And then I'd also say, looking at that long, like the longue durée of history, I teach at SIPA and at Cornell Tech, and I always shock my policy students because I make them read books about like the British water system in the 1900s or the 1800s, right? And they're not used to reading anything that goes before 1980. And yet you see those patterns, and history doesn't repeat itself, but there are some patterns that you can learn from. And so I think looking broader and looking in comparison is probably the starting point.
Yeah, I agree with you on the value of comparative law and really thinking about international examples. And other countries have simply thought about this for a longer period of time and with different influences on their policymaking. So that's right. I took a group of students last week to Governor's Island and to learn more about the new climate center. What are your thoughts on the climate center, and what do you hope happens as a result of its development?
Well, look, I'm really enthusiastic about what's shaping up to happen there. I think it's one example, though, I'd say, of a blossoming of focus in New York City around the study and the research related to climate. You know, you look at what Columbia is doing with the climate school, you look at innovations at the new school, you look at a phenomenal amount of things that NYU and Tandon have been doing on climate. You look at PACE, you look at what your own institution has done. I mean, New York City is a phenomenal center for climate research. And the climate school at or the climate center at Governor's Island, I'm sure will contribute to that. But part of what it does, part of what it brings the city is it can help anchor the green economy here. You know, there's a breadth of the green economy that's going to involve solar installers and people who set up composting facilities and you know, great entry level and blue collar jobs that are going to happen as a result of it. But New York City also needs to attract the white collar jobs, the entrepreneurs, and those businesses are going to set up, you know, whether it is the banks that do green loans, the entrepreneurs who set up clean tech, they're going to be interested in having the researchers who, whether they are scientists or engineers or legal experts, that are doing research at the forefront of climate there. And that's, I think, the kind of work that the whole New York City academic community can contribute to.
Yeah, I think we will all benefit from it, and it's exciting. And I'm sort of thinking about our own role in that, and I look forward to doing more with our school in that regard. And I think it's a real moment for law schools, and one that they're just starting to truly think about with any depth. So we greatly appreciate your time today, your wisdom always. It's exciting to hear exceptional leaders like yourself with such deep expertise and a passion and care for the public good. And this is a great forum to have showcased all that you're doing, and we appreciate the great work you're doing. Thank you so much.
I want to echo those words. Thank you for so much, and also for making it really clear the breadth of the challenge that the city faces in so many different areas. And I thank the questioners also for bringing that out, and you, though, so clearly answering. So this is a breakfast, I think, at least for speaking for myself, I came away learning things, and I appreciate it, and I appreciate the morning. Thank you so much. We look forward to hearing from you again, maybe in a year, and come back and we can talk more about this. Thank you so much, everybody, for attending, and thank you for the questions. Thank you all. See you in September.